In part one, we provided the resources, the metaphysics that are needed in order to understand Avicenna's argument for the existence of God. This is a version of a cosmological argument. And so we're taking the metaphysics that he's developed and considering how he thinks that this system of metaphysics leads him to the conclusion that God exists. Keep in mind, of course, he's following Aristotle in his argumentation. Now, when Avicenna states that something has existence that is possible, that means that it's contingent. So it may exist or it may not. It's something that's possible. So in theory, my fourth child is possible, even though there is no such thing in existence. Now, in order for it to exist, it must have a cause for its existence. This cause then is going to be hypothetically necessary. That is, if the effect exists, then the cause must exist. This would be the case with my third child, who in fact does exist. Given that she exists, we would say, if she exists, it's necessary that I exist. I am a cause of her existence. Of course, her mother is a cause of her existence as well. So we have the hypothetically necessary cause for anything that's contingent to exist. All right, let's set up the argument and get into it here. An assumption that is not a very big assumption at all is that some contingent things exist. You and I are contingent things. The screen you're looking at, to be more clear as an example, is a contingent thing. And so here's the reason. We have the quiddity of any contingent thing is not going to be sufficient for its existence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a contingent thing. So every contingent being has its existence bestowed on it from something other than itself. So that which bestows existence on another must be an existing cause. It must already be in existence. So a building is contingent. It is requiring its necessary, hypothetically necessary cause is going to be the architect and the building construction crew, all the people that bring it about that the building exists. And so it relies on these other things for its existence. Now, part two of stage one goes on. If the existing, that is hypothetically necessary cause for the building, maybe the architect, that bestows existence is also contingent, which would be the case, then it also requires an existing, that is a hypothetically necessary cause in order to bestow existence on it. So assuming the architect is contingent, then the architect had something that had to exist prior to it in a metaphysical sense and in fact in a temporal sense in order for it to exist. Obviously the architect's parents are what we're talking about here. Now, this series of causes could not go on to infinity unless, that is, there was something that brings about the necessity of the causes. Now, it's not clear here to me if at this point Avicenna is talking about the necessity of the chain's existence itself, or a necessary point, temporally speaking. I'm going to leave for this argument, I won't say definitively one way or another on that, but in any case, it's clear that Avicenna says you can't have an infinite chain of contingent beings, so you have to have a necessary being that causes the chain to exist. Therefore, there's at least one being whose existence is necessary. So now we have the existence of a necessary being, and we can go on to stage two. Now, part one of stage two, let's just consider the thesis overall for stage two before we get into part one the premises. The thesis is going to be that whose existence is necessary in itself has no equal. So there's only going to be one such being. Now, we have a lot of work to do before we get there, and there's more work to do in order to fulfill the argument. So this is where we're going to end up having a stage 3 that's part of our reasoning here. And this stage 2, in part 2 especially, it starts to get a little complicated. So you may have to rewind and listen again. Stick with it. It makes sense, okay? Suppose there were 2 beings that were co-equal whose existence were necessary. So we have 2 necessary beings, and the necessity of their existence has to be due to their essences. That's the supposition here. So we're considering just one of those, and we're saying, well, of this necessary being, either it is necessary through itself or it's not. Now we're going to leave that disjunction or not, and let's put it aside until stage 3. So we're just going to look at the first possibility here in stage 2. So we're considering it being necessary through itself. Now, if it's necessary through itself and co-equal with some other being, and it's easier just to talk about 2 here, the argument would work with any number greater than 1. But let's focus on just being 2. So we're talking about co-equal necessary beings. Then that other necessary being that exists also would need to have its necessity within itself. It's necessary in itself, so that we have 2 of these beings. And then Avicenna says, if another necessary being exists, which is necessary in itself, then the first is necessary through itself and also through another. Now, this premise itself needs a little bit of support, it seems to me. My friend Peter Adamson, who is an expert on Arabic philosophy, suggests that the idea here has to do with the attributes that the necessary being has, which would include existing with another necessary being that has its necessity from within itself. So that attribute's going to be necessary, because all attributes of a necessary being must be necessary. Otherwise, the necessary being wouldn't be what it is. It wouldn't be the kind of being that it is. And if all that's the case, then we have premise 3. If there's another necessary being that exists, which is necessary within itself, then the first being is going to be necessary through itself and also through that other necessary being. But it's not possible to be necessary through itself and also through another. That's an incoherent idea. For to be necessary through another is to be merely possible in itself. So, therefore, we can conclude for stage 2 that there cannot be 2 necessary beings whose necessity is within itself or themselves. So if you have a necessary being that has its necessity from within itself, there's only going to be one. Now, in part 1, we argued that there is a necessary being. In part 2, we said that if it has its necessity within itself, then there's only one. So in part 3, what we're going to do is continue with stage 2, stage 3, what we're going to do is argue that if we have this being that has its necessity from within itself, and it cannot exist without another, we still have a loose end from stage 2. So that's what we're exploring in stage 3. So let's consider that possibility, that loose end that we left there, the idea that from stage 1, we have our necessary being, but the idea that maybe it's not necessary through itself. So this is the alternative of the disjunctive premise 1 of stage 2. Now, suppose that the 2 co-equals are necessary with respect to the other, but not in respect to themselves. Again, we're talking about the possibility that there are more than one necessary beings. Easier to talk about two. So if the one's necessary with respect to the other, then it's merely possible in itself. And likewise, that other one, the second one, will be merely possible in itself and necessary with respect to the other. Well, then, if we have this second not merely possible in itself, then they're not going to be co-equals, because that was the premise we started with. So the necessity of the first comes from the necessity of the second, while the necessity of the second comes from the necessity of the first. And now we have, again, an incoherent idea. 10 is impossible. You can't have two necessary beings, each relying on the other for its necessity. So the two can't be necessary with respect to the other. And so we can't have two co-equal beings whose existence is necessary, but dependent on something else. So that means we have what we argued for in stage 2. We have one necessary being whose necessity is within itself. And so that's our conclusion of all three stages. We put them all three together now. We have the initial argument from contingency. We have the discussion of the possibilities related to the necessary beings. And that leads us to the conclusion that there is one and only one necessary being whose necessity is within itself. And that, as Aquinas likes to say, is something that we all call God. Now, just one more thing to add here. Another way of thinking about it, if stage 2 was a bit too complicated, and it is complicated, here's another possible way that Avicenna may have thought that you could get to the conclusion that he derives in stage 2. So here are the steps. That which is necessary in itself can't be composite because of our chart, right? We had our chart, we had necessary beings, and then we had a special kind of necessary being that's necessary within itself. And we said that it could not be composite. So he's already assuming that. And it has nothing that could be shared with another being. And that would include, of course, its essence. So, but if a necessary being exists, which is necessary within itself, then its essence is to exist necessarily. And it's impossible that it exists with an attribute that could be shared with another. So then no other being can exist with the same essence. And that means no other being can exist whose existence is necessary in itself. So that's an alternative path to the conclusion that we reach in stage 2. So we have arguments. Avicenna's argument for the existence of God based on contingency and necessity, the cosmological argument. And in part 3, we will continue with some of Avicenna's ideas about causation.